Hi, my name is Bill Wiese. I'm the author of the book 23 Minutes in Hell, and thank you for joining me. I'd like to share one personal aspect from the vision of hell that God gave me. Now, I also mention this in my book, 23 Minutes in Hell. Now, during the return from hell, Jesus and I ascended up out of the earth. We traveled above the earth in a whirlwind tunnel. Now, there are many verses about the whirlwind, but just to go on, it extended up out of the atmosphere until we were now out in space. Now, I looked back and viewed the earth. It was just hung there on nothing. It looked massive and was turning so precisely on its axis. It was the most exhilarating and overwhelming sight that I had ever imagined. Now, to see the earth hanging on nothing was more than words can describe. Now, I could feel God's power, and I knew that everything was so perfectly in His control. The vast oceans are held within their boundaries, not moving past His command. And the earth exhibits His absolute power and control. And not only the earth, but the entire universe with all its planets and stars. And not one sparrow falls to the ground apart from your Father knowing it. And the very hairs of our head are all numbered, as Matthew 10 states. Now, the expanse of His great power is simply inconceivable. And with all that power, it's a good thing that He is a good and loving God. Now, if you give most people a little earthly power, they become prideful, overconfident, and less compassionate. Yet God has all power, and He is love. He is love. And that doesn't mean that everything that happens on the earth is His will. For that very reason, as Christians, we need to pray that your will be done on earth as it is in heaven, as Matthew 6:10 states. Now, as Jesus and I began moving toward the earth, the continents came into view. And I remember the moment when we re-entered the atmosphere. I know that re-entering the Earth's atmosphere is an extremely complicated ordeal for astronauts. And I sensed when we passed through that barrier. Now, I believe that anyone viewing Earth from space would have a difficult time denying a creator. My parents lived near Cape Canaveral, Florida, and they would host astronauts in their home on occasion. And indeed, many of them had become Christians after going to space and seeing God's creation. I was also reminded of God's love and His kindness. He knows the most intimate details of our lives, yet He oversees the universe. As I grew up as a child, I used to watch Star Trek, and as I mentioned, had always dreamed of seeing space. It's an amazing thing to me that the Lord would remember even so small of a thing as my childhood desire, and would allow me to experience space with Him. These next verses declare that it is God who holds the earth in its location and causes it to turn on its axis so precisely, and He is in perfect control of the vast universe. It also states that the earth is a sphere and not flat as man thought for centuries. God revealed the truth long before men knew it. Now, Job 26:7 says, He hangeth the earth upon nothing. Isaiah 40:22 says, It is He who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them out like a tent to dwell in. Now, these next verses are why the vast oceans do not overtake the dry land. And people depend on this fact as they build homes and buildings right up to the sea's edge. They do not realize that the oceans would normally vary in their borders if God didn't give His command. Psalms 104:9 says, You have set a boundary that they may not pass over, that they may not return to cover the earth. Proverbs 8:29, When He assigned to the sea its limits, so that the waters would not transgress His command, when He marked out the foundations of the earth. Job 38:11, When I said, thus far you may come, but no further, and here your proud waves must stop. Now, these next verses show that it is God who made the vast universe with all its stars, and He even gives each star a name. Now, how many are there? Isaiah 40:12 says, who has measured the waters in his hollow of his hand and measured the heaven with a span. His hand spans the universe. Is that a big God or what? Isaiah 40:26 says, "Lift up your eyes on high and see who has created these things, who brings out their host or stars by number. He calls them all by name, by the greatness of his might and the strength of his power. Not one is missing." Psalm 147:4. He counts the number of the stars. He calls them all by name. Psalms 104:2, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain. Psalms 8:3, when I look at the night sky and see the work of your fingers, the moon and the stars, you set it in place. We have rain to water the crops and to drink, yet the water comes from the sea, which has salt. Salt water would not be possible to drink and it would kill the plant life. Yet he transforms the water in the clouds and removes the salt. The wisdom of God is astounding. Job 36:28 says, which the clouds do drop and distill upon man abundantly. There's that word distill. Deuteronomy 32:2, my doctrine shall drop as the rain, my speech shall distill as the dew, as the small rain upon the tender herb, and as the showers upon the grass. Amos 5:8, he calls for the waters of the sea and pours them out on the face of the earth. Now he created the atmospheres also above the earth, and each atmosphere has its perfect purpose. Amos 9:6 says, he who builds his layers in the sky and has founded his strata in the earth. Now I was so amazed to grasp how God has every star and planet in perfect control and order. I could also grasp how big the universe really is. Our God is endless in his power, might, and wisdom. How could anyone look at the skies and deny there is a creator? Romans 1 says, they know the truth about God because he has made it obvious to them. Forever since the world was created, people have seen the earth and the sky. Through everything God made, they can clearly see his invisible qualities, his eternal power and divine nature. So they have no excuse for not knowing God.